And just, yeah, should be good. All right.
So I'm looking left at you.
Okay, and just make sure. Okay. As an individual faculty senate member, what was your position on the matter then, on the renaming of it?
I really thought we should rename it. I thought it was pretty unconscionable for us to have a dorm named after a proponent of slavery. I understand that the thing that was said at the time was these dorms were named kind of after the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So there's Lincoln Hall and there's Douglas Hall. And the idea was, we're commemorating the fact that one of those debates took place here in Charleston by naming the dorms those two things. But historians talked at the time of our debate that in the 50s, when these dorms were built, I think it was the 50s, a lot of pushback against the 60s civil rights movement that was just budding at the time was to erect a bunch of Civil War memorabilia and statues to Civil War generals, to Southern Confederate generals, which is a controversy that we're seeing play out now, where they're trying to take a lot of those down. Well, a lot of those went up. Most of them went up after the Civil War, but they were usually in response to pushes for civil rights for African Americans. So the idea of naming the dorm Douglas Hall, an argument really could be made that was as a kind of stick it to civil rights issues that were coming to bear at the time.
Yeah, I was a member of Faculty Senate in 2010. I wasn't chair, but I was a member of the Senate, and the issue came to the Senate for discussion, right? The proposal was, the idea was that we should rename Douglas Hall.
Yeah.
And we, as a Senate, we talked about it. We discussed various issues. It came out fairly early in the discussion that the hall had originally been named Douglas Hall as a twin for Lincoln Hall. They had been named at the same time, and that the intention explicitly was that this was to commemorate the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Charleston debate, of course, was one of the series of debates that Lincoln and Douglas had had. So it was discovered, right? It was unearthed that there was no question that that's how the naming had come about. It wasn't specifically intended as an honor for Stephen A. Douglas. It was intended to commemorate this event, which had been important in Charleston's history.
I feel like, the way the issue was presented, I really didn't have a problem with renaming. I thought it was perhaps a good thing to do and a sensitive thing to do, but there was also kind of some question in my mind as to why it was being raised at this particular time, because the person who was raising it had left EIU and had moved on to a different position, a different faculty position somewhere else, and I sort of thought, well, this seems I don't know why he's bringing it up now. He's kind of left the institution, so it's still an important issue, but why the need to to bring it up at this time?
The major driver of this effort was Chris Hanlon.
Okay.
And he was in the English department, and in the English department, I think I could be wrong about all, but anyone I spoke to about it was pretty strongly on the side of wanting to change the name of the dorm.
Back when I first filed or submitted a proposal to rename Douglas Hall with the University Naming Committee at Eastern, I had just finished my first book. I was looking for a project, and while the usual thing that a academic like me is going to do is to look for a project that sort of is about publication or furthering my own sort of curriculum vitae, I had for years been amazed that there was a dormitory at Eastern's campus named after Stephen Douglas, who was an ally of what was then called the slave power. And while I understood that there is a sort of sense of connection to Douglas because of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debate that took place in Charleston, it seemed to me to be, a misrepresentation of common consensus about Stephen Douglas's profile as an historical figure, as a political actor, to honor him by putting his name on a dormitory. So I sort of fell into this by way of thinking, well, I'm certainly going to submit a submission to have the name changed.
Well, I certainly remember there was a lot of passion and a lot of exuberance around people's opinions about it. I talked to a lot of alums who were vehemently opposed to changing it because they felt like it was a symbol of their college experience when they lived there. Talked to a lot of other individuals who saw it as a issue around not being supportive of a more progressive, open situation that they felt like the naming of a hall after Stephen Douglas was not representing. So there was a lot of passion on both sides.
So we met, as I said, first I heard about it in the end of the spring semester of 2010. Then the summer came and went, and I'd sort of forgotten all about it. And then he reached out again in the fall and he wanted to have like a kind of a panel discussion, right? And I said, sure, I'll be more than happy to participate. What I didn't know at the time, what he failed to tell me at the time, was that this panel discussion was not set up as a kind of open-ended question Q&A kind of thing where members of the community would come and ask questions. It was set up as a sort of debate format, right? And I was on the other side all of a sudden. So that was, that kind of got me, put me off guard a little bit. After that is when I believe Chris Hanlon publishes an editorial in the Den, and is at this point is sort of taking his campaign to the various faculty bodies, student senate, that kind of thing. And at that point, I wrote an op-ed piece in the Den, explaining why I didn't think this was a good idea.
I was asked by another member of the history department, Mark Hubbard, to participate on a panel discussing the issue of Stephen Douglas and his memorial. And that was pretty much how I got involved, and I appeared at a panel discussion with 2 in the affirmative to remove Douglas's name, or perhaps replace it by adding a second S and naming it after Frederick Douglass, the black abolitionist of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and into the Civil War. I was on the opposed side, in part because it seemed to me to be a ahistorical attempt to make the people of the past somehow live up to the standards of the present.
Generally speaking, I got, sort of vague encouragement, but for some reason, once it became a public issue, I saw a reversal of their position, and they began to sort of, broadcast the rejoinder to the name change suggestion, which was that to change the names of buildings that were named after historical actors is presentist, is a way of exporting contemporary values onto the past, is a way of erasing the past. That argument that to view the past through the lens of the present is somehow anachronistic and does violence to historical facts always struck me as an extremely shallow way of looking at history, an unreflexive way of understanding history. I think the moment we choose to focus on anything from history, we have already imported our own values into history. There's no avoiding it.
When the time came to vote on the proposal that was made was that we take Lincoln Hall and Douglas Hall and rename them both as Debate Hall East and Debate Hall West.
Okay.
And I thought, first of all, that's a horrible name. Nobody wants to be a debate hall, and nobody wants to say, well, I'm Debate Hall East and not Debate Hall West. But more to the point, that would mean that we were renaming Lincoln Hall as well. And I said at the time in Senate, right, does the Senate feel that not only does Douglas deserve to have his name taken off a hall, but that Lincoln also doesn't deserve to have a hall named after him on this campus?
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to me that nobody had an adequate answer to that question. And so I said, before the vote was ever brought up, I said, I'm not going to vote yes for any proposal that says we have to remove Lincoln's name from Lincoln Hall on this campus. And so that made it easy for me when the vote came up and the proposal was to rename both halls as Debate Hall East and Debate Hall West. I reiterated my position. I was not going to vote for anything that was going to remove Lincoln's name from Lincoln Hall. And so I was the only person that voted no. EIU has a naming committee, and so the suggestion to rename it went to the naming committee. The naming committee debated the issue. Ultimately, they and the president decided not to rename either of the two halls. By that point, of course, it was entirely out of my hands.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's gone. It's gone from Senate. The decision has been forwarded to the bodies that decide, and they have decided.
There was one meeting I went to where a woman came in with a bunch of pages printed off Wikipedia about the times that Lincoln had been racist, right? Because nobody was saying we should change the name of Lincoln Hall. And so she was kind of getting on this tear about how Lincoln said this racist thing and Lincoln did that racist thing. And, you know, yes, like Lincoln had some really, what we would consider today to be really troubling ideas about African Americans, about slavery. And then he evolved to a certain point, and probably still had at his, you know, throughout his administration, ideas that would have troubled many people today. But he also freed the slaves, right? Mm. So, yes, he was not a perfect person, but he also did something that I think we can agree was really laudatory and worthy of remembering and worthy of celebrating. Douglas, not so much, right?
Yeah.
So that argument was really common at the time. Well, Lincoln, you know, if you're gonna rename, you know, look at Lincoln. He did bad things. He said bad things. And actually, then are we gonna be? And you can hear this debate happening now. Well, if we pull down a statue of General Robert E. Lee, then what's to stop us? Why shouldn't we pull down statues of Thomas Jefferson? He owned slaves too, and you know. And so that slippery slope argument was one I heard a lot, where it was like, if we rename this dorm, then we're going to have to rename every dorm where people don't have spotless records. And I think I just always came back to the idea of nobody has a spotless record, but not everybody was adamant about the positive side of slavery, right? It seems to me that that's a line we could draw.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the issue for a lot of people, for a lot of us on campus, including the administration in the end, was that if we're going to rename Douglas Hall, then we're going to have to rename a lot of different things, and do we really want to go down that road? You know, and I think that in the end, the community said no.
I look back at it now and see what was kind of a perfect storm. I don't know that I would rank one factor as more important than the others or more decisive than the others. There were two things happening there. Yeah. On the one hand, so many Eastern students, including the Daily Eastern News, it must be said, just repeated the refrain that it was not important to talk about history, that this was not our business somehow. And I was really truly dismayed by that, especially when faculty started to echo that. Faculty in the history department, like Mark Hubbard.
My academic perspective aligns with my personal perspective. I don't think I'd be much of an academic if if my academic perspective or my scholarship didn't really kind of reflect who I was, in some fundamental sense. It's easy for us to condemn a lot of people for their racially bigoted views back then. But, again, it seems to me what is most noteworthy about Douglass is the differences that existed between, say, a Douglass and a Jefferson Davis or a Robert E. Lee or a Nathan Bedford Forrest, okay? Those folks committed treason. Douglass did not, right?
Long ago and far away, William Shakespeare said that the good that men do is often buried with their bones, and the evil lives on beyond them. Well, without in any way promoting Stephen Douglass to sainthood, he was very much a man of his age, with prejudices and biases, including racial prejudices, of the period in which he lived. While we can condemn those biases, those prejudices, while we can look askance at his even tacit support of slavery, I think that would be a mutilation of history to remove Stephen Douglass from the from Eastern Illinois campus. Perhaps he should have aspired to something else, but that would make him a man not of his age, but a man of greater vision than most of his contemporaries had. When we start to remove people, to erase their memories, because we do not agree with their views, it means that there's little to hold on to.
Okay, so if this made it to the faculty senate again, do you think the discussion would be the same or different?
I think the discussion would be very different because based on the experiences that we've seen other parts of the country go through when they've tried to remove Confederate monuments. Both the fact that there's a huge constituency that is wanting to keep these monuments. So there is a sense that, we are more aware, I think, than when Chris Hamlin started his effort. I think he was shocked by the blowback. I don't think we would be shocked by the blowback anymore, that there are people who embrace these monuments and want to keep them for whatever reason they want to say that they are.
I believe that most of Eastern students have a political vision and have a moral vision and are interested in sort of watching justice movements succeed. And so I would challenge more Eastern students to not only engage on Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or wherever, but to actually sort of plan to show up and support with their bodies, with their presence, the direction they would like to see Eastern take. If they did that, I think they would find that they vastly outnumber the people who are opposed, if they did it.